Tensions in the Middle East seem to show no signs of cooling down. Yesterday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again vowed to forge ahead in the IDF's goal of, quote, annihilating Hamas. Israeli forces have continued their construction of a, quote, buffer zone along the Israel-Gaza border against the express wishes of the Biden administration, a sign the divide between Bibi Netanyahu and Biden may be wider than ever. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels in Yemen also vowed to dig in on their current blockade of the Red Sea until humanitarian aid is permitted to pass unfettered through to Gaza. A new report in Politico asserts that the timing of the Red Sea attacks could not be worse for Democrats. The growing military conflict in a key trade corridor is threatening to unleash economic havoc on the global economy ahead of November.
Well, meanwhile, 9 people were killed and 75 were injured on Wednesday in a direct hit on a United Nations training center turned shelter in southern Gaza run by UNRWA, the UN agency that assists Palestinians. UNRWA's commissioner said the compound is a clearly marked UN facility and its coordinates were shared with Israeli authorities, as we do for all of our facilities. He said, adding, once again, a blatant disregard of basic rules of war. Interestingly about that UNRWA story is how it was reported. Adam Johnson, who is a media critic, has a very popular podcast called Citations Needed, pointed out that the New York Times headline was at least 9 killed as tank rounds hit UN shelter in the besieged Gaza City. No mention of who dropped the weapons, who actually hit what tank, where the tank rounds came from. And within the article, it's noted the UN officials did not directly blame Israel, but the shelter and a vocational training center had been hit by 2 tank rounds. Israel is the only combatant in Gaza with tanks. So it's going so far as to say, to hold space for the idea that I guess Hamas could secretly have had a tank that it drove up out of a tunnel that no one had seen before and bombed a UN facility that was administering aid to the Palestinian people. But here's where we are. So it's a really interesting picture that's emerging. Israel is creating a buffer zone against the stated goals and demands of the American government, of the Biden administration. It is now killed additional UN workers after having killed over 100 in the largest death for UN staff members in the history of the organization has happened in Gaza. And you are getting media coverage that keeps saying things like Biden is frustrated, Biden is trying to put distance between him and Netanyahu, Biden is wanting to pressure, Biden has been pressuring. But as Adam Johnson points out on his show, and I actually had him as a guest last night on my show, that language hasn't changed. And there has been no real reckoning with the fact that despite this idea that Biden is pressuring Netanyahu, he has declined to take actions that would not just rhetorically pressure him, but prevent him materially from doing these kinds of things, like withdrawing aid, like not giving additional weapons to Israel, and like not using our authority, our veto power at the UN to block any resolutions that would create accountability for Israel.
Yeah, it's hard to reach any other conclusion than that Biden is very feckless. I mean, he should get out of Netanyahu what he thinks is good for the U.S. I mean, if he thinks backing Israel no matter what they do and funding their war effort and continue to support them and not asking a lot of questions about the number of civilian deaths is in America's best interest, then he should just say that. And maybe that is what he thinks. But they concede, his people speaking on his behalf concede that they're uncomfortable with the direction the war effort's taking, with the number of civilian casualties, with policies like the buffer zone, with Netanyahu's stated opposition to a 2-state solution. That is contrary to U.S. policy. So why, if a key ally is articulating, more than articulating, than pursuing war aims that we believe are contrary to our interests, why aren't we doing anything about it?
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating. Like, either do it or don't do it.
Right.
If you think this is bad for America, then you, as the president of America, if this reflects badly, if this puts us at risk of economic difficulties because of what's going on in the Red Sea, or at risk of blowback from terrorism or anything else, then you could, again, I wouldn't twist their arms at the UN or anything else, but yes, you could withdraw the aid for certain. It's American taxpayer money. We're not obligated to give it to them. So it's very odd.
Well, to be
Odd's
clear,
not the right word. Some other word.
To be clear, we wouldn't be
that.
twisting anybody's arm at the UN. We would simply stop vetoing the stated desires of well over 100 countries that very much want there to be the same accountability for Israel as exists for all of these countries in the global south, which are regularly sanctioned and censured and are criticized by international organizations. What is emerging is a portrait that reveals that there are different rules that the United States and our client states like Israel have to abide by as compared to the rest of the world. And it is only further isolating us and lowering public opinion. And Biden is someone who held himself out there in 2020 as someone who was going to restore America on the world stage and all that kind of pablum after the Trump years. And it's really not clear that that's what he's doing. That's on top of the fact that even the humanitarian implications aside, the foreign policy implications aside, domestically, he's also getting dinged so hard by his own party and people outside of it who overwhelmingly believe that there should at very least be a ceasefire here, that Israel has more than taken its pound of flesh for the tragedy of October 7th. Joe Biden cannot make a speech without protesters demanding that there be a ceasefire. And what you're seeing is what's emerging is, depending on what the event is, oftentimes the pro-ceasefire protester will get drowned out by people saying 4 more years, 4 more years. And this is setting up this really, I think, on point and revealing paradigm where on one side people are saying, we are ruining our reputation on a global scale. We are facilitating the death of, at this point, over 25,000 people. We can't even really keep track of that number anymore, because every institution in Gaza that was empowered and able to keep track, whether it was hospitals, government facilities, churches, mosques, have been bombed to smithereens. And we want that to stop. And the other half is saying, well, elect Biden for 4 more years, elect Biden for 4 more years. And it, I think, is really revealing what the priorities of the administration are and what the priorities, frankly, of our bipartisan government are. And it's exactly why I think there's increasingly people who are disaffected from the two-party system. Yeah.
I mean, I know we argue about this every time it comes up. I support a ceasefire. I want the violence to stop. I want Israel to stop killing Gazans, to stop killing Palestinians. I want Hamas to stop killing Israelis. I wish that would happen right now. I wish it had happened before any of this devastation. I just don't. I wish it could happen. I don't understand how it can happen. Israel's position is that it can't happen until Hamas is completely taken out, or that at least its top leadership agrees to go into exile or surrenders or something like that, and they're willing to continue the war until that happens. And Hamas is not willing to abide by that, but has rejected that agreement, and so it continues.
The concern is that Hamas has only been around for, less than 2 decades, and the occupation has been going on in some form or another since 1948. And what we know from the history is that people like Netanyahu have been stridently opposed to a 2-state solution or any Palestinian sovereignty since the get-go. It's the basis of his entire political agenda. So what people are saying, what the real tension here is whether or not a return to the status quo, where millions of people have to live in apartheid conditions, is going to be adequate. And this is not a endorsement of any kind of behavior, but the reason that Hamas felt justified, and they've articulated this, felt justified in acting and attacking on October 7th is because, absent any kind of agitation out of Palestinians, the world is very happy to accept that status quo. They're the ones that have to live that reality, and they have tried every form of nonviolent protest there is. There have been BDS movements, the effort to boycott, sanction, and divest from Israel to create the same kind of economic pressure on Israel that enabled the end of apartheid in South Africa. And here in the United States of America, our government, or state governments around the country, have tried, and successfully in some ways, made that effort illegal. You cannot get a government contract, for instance. Abby Martin experienced this. If you have supported the BDS movement and they find out on social media or something like that. Okay, so they don't want us to use economic sanctions. They don't want us to use boycott movements. What about a protest movement? All right, in 2018, thousands of Palestinians participated in this March of Return, where they walked alongside the border fence demanding rights, demanding liberation. And thousands of Palestinians were shot and hundreds were killed in that exercise by IDF snipers who were standing on the top of the wall. There's a whole generation of people that have amputations below the waist because they were being targeted by IDF soldiers as they peacefully protested. So here we are, and as much as we can say, well, if Hamas just surrenders XYZ, we know from history that that's not the case. Largely even because more moderate groups, pro-Palestinian Palestinian leadership, was in fact undermined purposefully by Benjamin Netanyahu because he didn't want to have to defend the case as to why he didn't support personally a two-state solution. He wanted to be able to say, well, it's not even in my hands. The radicals over there don't even want to eat. There's no negotiating with them. So purposefully Pied Pipering more radical people into leadership so that he never has to have this real conversation. So I think the warning call is this is not going to be a reset back to October 7th. And Israelis and Palestinians are never going to be safe unless there is an agreement that genuinely respects the self-determination and human rights of all groups involved.
I don't really disagree with anything that you said. I want that resolution for the area. I really do. Yeah. So I wish it was possible. More Rising right after this.